Welcome back. In this video we're going to continue working with our Edge Detect node, and I'm going to point out a few limitations to the Edge Detect node and also show you a couple of ways of getting around those limitations so that you can use it the way that you probably expect that we would be using it. So the first thing I want to point out is if we go into Eevee, you can see the Edge Detect node does not work at all. Now that's because the Edge Detect node is essentially based on this bevel node, and the bevel node unfortunately only works when we use it in cycles. The second thing I want to point out on this Edge Detect node, at the moment we do have a nice effect for the edge breakup, but one thing that we don't have the ability to do at the moment is just to have a few individual chips along the edge instead of just having a solid white line or a kind of noisy white line. It would be nice to have some chips. So let's set that up at the moment. So I'll go back into my edge node. I'm just going to move this noise texture out the way a little bit. We'll move our group inputs as well, so we have a little bit of space. So our noise texture is going into slot B here, and we want to add just another one of these color mix nodes in and give us a slightly different effect. So we'll duplicate this multiply node and we'll plug it in here. And we'll take this factor and we're also going to put it into slot B. But if we take a color ramp node, put it into this second slot, and we just change these values down a little bit, we can start to get a kind of chip effect here. So what happens here is now we have a second factor. So we have our regular edge breakup, and now we have our chipped edge breakup. The same noise texture has been used here, so our detail, our roughness, our scale, all still come into play, but now we have a little bit more control to add a kind of more chipped edge and not just a solid white line. So let's take this factor, plug it in here, we'll go to our group settings, and we'll change this from factor to chips. We'll keep our default at 1, our min and max at 0 and 1, and we don't really need anything else there. We'll just tidy up our node tree a little bit, just so it's a little bit more readable, and I think that's going to be okay. We'll come back out of there. Now that we have that Edge Detect node fixed, we can just test our settings here. So you can see our chips on and off. And we can also tweak our Edge Detect factor as well. You can see that with Edge Detect factor at 0, we don't have access to the chips at all because it's all based on that noise texture. We can then go in, we can tweak our roughness, we can tweak our detail as well to get the exact setting that we want in there. And of course we can increase and decrease our scale as well to get exactly what we're going for. So maybe this is something more like what you're looking for. Again, we can just tweak these settings to whatever setting. Again, you can just tweak these settings as much or as little as you want. I think a scale of about 10 actually looks quite nice on this. That's quite a nice edge breakup with a few gaps here and there. And that looks pretty good. Again, we do have our samples that we can tweak. Now let's say we want to use this as a mask. Now I think I do want to make this radius a little bit bigger, just so everything's a little bit more visible. Something like that is a little bit better. Now again, let's just say we want to use this as a mask to switch between two different materials that we'll create through this principled node. Let's grab a mix color node. And let's just work on color first of all. So let's do a kind of blender orange here. And let's do a kind of dark grey. Plug this into our base color. Now, looking at this Edge Detect, you're probably thinking that we're going to get a nice bit of orange on the flat surfaces, and we're going to get a nice, solid, contrasty grey on these other areas. So let's have a look. And you can see it's actually pretty low contrast. We're really just getting a bit of noise there. Now, maybe this is exactly what you're going for. You just want a little bit of discoloration. But what we really want here is a real hard mask so that we can mask off these colors. We can also mask off metallic and roughness and even the normal map. So let's duplicate this down, put this into metallic. we want to turn off all the metallic on the plastic, and we want to turn up the metallic on the grey, and you can see still no high contrast. Let's duplicate this one again. We'll put this into roughness. In this case, let's make our plastic pretty shiny. Let's make our metal really shiny, and again, still no contrast. Let's duplicate this one again. You're going to add in a vector bump node. Plug this into our normal map. Plug this into our height. We want to make our plastic go up. We want to make our metal go down. And again, we're not really getting a good effect there. You can start to see we're getting even a lot of shading artifacts on this. Now, it looks slightly better on this second cube. You can see we're getting a nice chipped away breakup on the edges here, but still we're not getting any high contrast. This all comes down to the fact that this edge detect node works based on this bevel node, which essentially renders out this new bevel. And because of the way rendering works, we are getting a lot of grayscale values within this result. Now, you may think there's a solution to this, and that is to just add a redirect node and then take something like a color ramp and maybe squeeze these values together. But you can see in actual fact, if we go into our principled node now, we're still not getting high contrast. If anything, we're actually losing some contrast there. So there's only really one way around this that I can think of, and that is to just bake out this mask once you have it correct, and then run it through something like a color ramp to get some more high contrast. So that leads us to the fact that now we have to do some baking. And that's actually quite useful because, as we mentioned before, we don't have any way of having this in Eevee without baking. So we might as well just go and do that extra step of baking this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a new image editor here. We'll go to image editor. I'm going to hit new, and I'm just going to call this edges. We'll take the width and the height. I'm just going to make these 2048. So it's a 2K texture. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to select my cube. I'm going to go to texture, image texture. Use this drop down to find this image that I've just created. Make sure this is highlighted. Make sure the cube that we are baking from is highlighted. We're going to go into our render settings. We're going to go to bake. I'm just going to turn off all the lighting. And I don't think there's anything else I need to change there. We're going to hit bake. We can see that it is baking. On the bottom here you can see this is slowly creeping up. It's actually not taking quite as long as I expected for the 2K texture. We should have maybe tried 4K, but we want to make sure we don't run out of memory as well, so that's always an issue. And once this renders out, this should appear up here in our image map. There we go, and now we have our nice image. Now you can see our cube was already unwrapped. Depending on the model you're using, you might have to unwrap that yourself. And now if we look through our image, you can see that we actually have our bake. So this is our edge detect node. You can see a lot more detail there, and this is our bake. Much less detail, but what we now have is we now have real values that we can adjust using a color ramp node. So let's go to something like smart so we can just fade this a little bit. Incidentally, if you ever want to do a kind of pixel art thing, instead of smart, you would use closest. Now you can see the actual pixels on our bake. You can see it is quite a low resolution, but by using something like cubic or by smart, you can kind of fade out that texture a little bit and get a better effect. So this is our edge detect node. This is the result we get. If we take this result and put it in here instead, this is our new result. Now, obviously, we'll have to tweak this a little bit to get the effect that we want. So it might be something closer to this that we want. Again, it's not perfect, but it's definitely working with more contrast than our edge detect node was. We'll maybe take this metallic color and just increase it up a little bit. And now we have chipped edge blocks. And the good thing about this is if we go into Eevee, we get the same result because now we're using this baked out mask instead of using the bevel node directly. And if we ever need to make any adjustments to this, all we have to do is go in, make our changes, select this, select the cube that we want to do, and just rebake that. And it's just a case of having to rebake it whenever you need it. And you'll be able to get access to that much higher contrast node. And that's essentially how you would use this node in your workflow. You will most likely have to use it to bake, unless all you want is just a nice render like this. Okay, one final thing before we go, and that is that now that we have this image that we have baked out, we still have to save it. So if we look at this top panel here, you can see that our image has a little asterisk next to it, and that's telling us that we have not saved this image. So although we have access to it within this node group under edges, what we don't have is access to it within our system. So we now have to go to Save As, just find somewhere to save that. I'm just going to put it on my desktop. I'm going to call it Edges PNG. I'm going to make sure the compression is all the way down. And I think everything else is fine. We'll just hit Save As. And now we have that image saved. So now if for some reason we lose that, we can always go into our image texture, open this up, go to our desktop, find our edges image and bring that back in. We'll also change the color space from sRGB to non-color. And we'll plug this into our color ramp and that brings that back. So now once you save your file and you reopen it, you'll no longer need to rebake this mesh. You'll have it already as an image and you just have to find that on your desktop if it's not already hooked up. Now one final thing that you'll have to do is the Edge Detect node now needs updated. We don't have to mark it as an asset again, but we do have to make sure that we save this file within our asset browser folder. Now since we have just updated an already existing one, we can just overwrite this Edge Detect over here. Now this new Edge Detect node will be available in our asset browser, replacing the old one. So join me in the next video and I'll show you a much easier way to bake textures in Blender. I'll see you then.